All right, let's get to some fun now, everybody. On a Friday night, it's time for us to switch out and do something for entertainment purposes. As I mentioned at the start of the show, we get to do some fiction now. Friday fiction. Relax, turn on the oven, put some popcorn on, who knows, hang out, mull some cider, settle down with a good short story. Now, as I mentioned, this comes from the writer behind Psycho. So we're going to go with a little Wordsmith Wednesday on a Friday and read a short story from somebody who was pretty darn productive, even as a kid. He got his first story published when he was a teenager, and we're going to go with The Outer Limits, Control Voice, and it's time for fiction.
There is nothing wrong with your television set. Do not attempt to adjust the picture. We are controlling transmission. If we wish to make it louder, we will bring up the volume. If we wish to make it softer, we will tune it to a whisper. We will control the horizontal. We will control the vertical. We can roll the image, make it flutter. We can change the focus to a soft blur, or sharpen it to crystal clarity. For the next hour, sit quietly and we will control all that you see and hear. We repeat, there is nothing wrong with your television set. You are about to participate in a great adventure. You are about to experience the awe and mystery which reaches from the inner mind to the outer limits.
Oh, yes. I love it. Outer Limits. Yes, the Sand Kings was really good on the Outer Limits. They redid it. It was phenomenal. Great stuff. George R.R. Martin story. Let's talk about the guy who wrote Psycho. As I mentioned, when I was at the Outer Limits, and those of you who are joining us for this segment, if it's packaged separately over at the former Star Trek Writing Fellow channel on YouTube and on Rumble, thanks for being here. This is the Liberty Conspiracy Show, which we broadcast live Monday through Friday at 6 p.m. on Rumble and on my X, which is at gardgoldsmith. But our audience right now, they get to hang out, chat inside Rumble, and put their posts on X as the Russian team with my brain chip receiver. We'll get those posts out there. We cover a lot of politics, a lot of breaking news, go into music and stuff like that. And then we jump over real quick, make the show as quick as possible, and we get into some fiction on Friday. And this time, we're combining Wordsmith Wednesday with Fiction Friday. So on Wednesdays, I like to talk about various writers who I could recommend to people and say, boy, this person's done some great stuff. Listen to this, or check out this. Hey, did you know that this character was created by this person? We talked about Charlie Chan. We've spoken about people like E.R. Edison, very influential on Tolkien, and things like that. And while I was at the Outer Limits in the TV show, and I haven't even really gotten into background stories on working at television and at the Outer Limits or Star Trek yet. Maybe a couple little anecdotes here and there, but I'll show you how we did it on separate episodes and so on. A former Star Trek Writing Fellow, also inside Liberty Conspiracy. But with the audience watching live, everybody, and if you're watching afterwards, at the beginning of this live program tonight, if you're watching the package later, I mentioned we're going to read a short story by the guy who wrote Psycho. Now, I happen to get to meet the guy who wrote the screenplay for Psycho. He was one of the co-creators of the original Outer Limits. His name was Joe Stefano. Joe wrote the screenplay based on the original novel by Robert Bloch. A lot of people associate Robert Bloch with Psycho, Psycho 2, and Psycho House, all of which are terrific. Separate stories, turned into movies, but novels themselves. He wrote sequels. They were so popular. So they associate Robert Bloch with slasher, killer, the maximization of a sort of noir type thing with additional concept of a crime that's happened. Someone is involved with the crime, then gets caught up in this place at this hotel with someone who is psychologically unbalanced. And coming out of the 50s, there's a lot of psychoanalysis that's starting to rise up in various forms in the West. And so the idea of psychoanalysis is coming around, and split personalities and things like that, right? Yeah. So they associate him with the movie, Anthony Perkins, all these things, Psycho. What they often don't know is that Robert Bloch was a big, big fan of HP Lovecraft and Arkham House Publishing and the magazine Weird Tales and the Pulps. And he actually wrote tons of stories in that vein. In fact, I want to show you. This is a publication from Chaosium Books, Mysteries of the Worm. Chaosium publishes, or has published, many, many books associated with Lovecraftian fiction. H.P. Lovecraft, August Derleth, the King in Yellow stuff, Ambrose Bierce's work, Brian Lumley's stuff, and this, an entire collection of Robert Bloch's Lovecraft Cthulhu type stuff. Now, before he did a lot of these stories, he was writing stories in the Lovecraftian vein and sending them off to the Weird Tales magazine. And so let me show you a little bit about Robert Bloch, because Psycho is just one tiny dimension of what Robert Bloch did. Born the same year as my father, 1917, here's fantasticfiction.com, used to be .co.uk. Robert Bloch wrote a fan letter to H.P. Lovecraft at the age of 16. Lovecraft encouraged the young boy to begin writing fiction and to submit his stories to Weird Tales. Thus began a 60-year writing career that is one of the most distinguished in the horror and mystery field. Bloch is today most famous as the author of Psycho. He's well known for having said, "Despite my ghoulish reputation, I really have the heart of a small boy. I keep it in a jar on my desk." His writing style is amazing. Beautiful, beautiful prose. And that's one of the things I want to stress, because when you get things that are sort of culturally brought into the milieu with a film, and you see a stark Hitchcock movie that shocked people, oftentimes I think those flashes sort of blind people to the substance of a writer's work. And once they can scratch the surface and get down in there, they realize, wow, this man was a very, very talented, working on his own, isolated, writing stories guy. And he communicated back and forth with people like H.P. Lovecraft. And so I want to show you a little bit more background on Robert Bloch. Born in Chicago, he was the son of Raphael Bloch, a bank teller, and Stella Loeb, a school teacher and social worker. Bloch's parents were German Jewish, but didn't practice Judaism. In 1923, the family moved to Maywood and then to Milwaukee. At the age of 9, Bloch saw his first horror movie, Phantom of the Opera, starring Lon Chaney, and slept for a long time afterwards with the light on. Weird Tales became his favorite reading. And this really was a remarkable time. I mentioned this before, but Weird Tales bridged the gap, and it really was an outcome. I talked a little bit about Robert E. Howard and how when I wrote the introduction to the Borderlands Press collection of Robert E. Howard's stories, not all of them, just a selection of them, I mentioned how he was one of the first who not only was a writer on his own, but one of the first people to introduce fandom and start working in other people's milieus. Robert E. Howard was a big fan of Lovecraft. They communicated with each other. And August Derleth was as well. Ambrose Bierce. They all communicated with each other. And so Lovecraft gave people permission to work within his world. Brian Lumley came up a little bit after that generation. And so a lot of these people, they were fans of the early fantasists like Lord Dunsany and E.R. Edison. And what we find is that those early fantasy stories and early horror stories like Frankenstein and Dracula some of those things, some of the horror stories by Arthur Conan Doyle. They had a real big impact on a number of these writers who weren't of that generation. They were a little bit behind, maybe on the tail end of that generation or the next generation. Depends how you measure generations, right? It's supposed to be you're old enough to sire another generation, but oftentimes they separate it by like 10 or 15 years. But people like Robert Bloch, born in 1917, they came in and they got to read maybe what, if you were a kid, you were reading comic books. Those weren't really around, but the pulps were around, and they had the daily comic strips coming around, and then radio serials. So there's this new blossoming of fantastic fiction that's now being populated for stories by people who were influenced by the early fantasists who weren't part of the pulps. Maybe they were writing for Penny Dreadfuls, or they were doing serialized novels like Alexander Dumas, you know, his adventure stories, or H. Rider Haggard, that sort of thing. Edgar Rice Burroughs, that sort of stuff. They were the ones who started this all off, and then the pulps take off. The pulps provide these writers great opportunities to write short stories and explore tricks and all sorts of things inside their stories. Then you get some of those people influencing others like Richard Matheson, William F. Nolan, George Clayton Johnson, Rod Serling, and television writing comes in. Harlan Ellison. So you can see the development all the way from the late 1800s, even earlier than that, really, if you look at, you know, people like Mary Shelley and Frankenstein, or Edgar Allan Poe, you know, that sort of thing. You get these people who are dealing with these suspense and then scary stories, folklore, that sort of thing, M.R. James and so on, and then they fuel this new generation in the pulps, and it just explodes. Unbelievable work from these people. So you can see Robert Bloch, influenced by Phantom of the Opera, becomes a very, very big fan of HP Lovecraft. And it says, as you see here, Bloch started writing stories while still in high school. His first appearance in print was a parody of HP Lovecraft entitled The Thing, which he wrote for The Quill, his Lincoln High School literary magazine. Okay. His first published work is what we're going to read tonight. He was 17 years old. Robert Bloch was 17 years old when he got this story published in Weird Tales. It's amazing. Really, really something else. And what's interesting here is there's a quote by my friend Doug Winter. He has here, I discovered, much to my surprise, and particularly if I was writing in the first person, that I could become a psychopath quite easily. I could think like one, and I could devise a manner of unfortunate occurrences. So I probably gave up a flourishing, lucrative career as a mass murderer. That is a quote of Robert Bloch in the book Faces of Fear by Douglas Winter. So again, this is Robert Bloch saying, I discovered, much to my surprise, and particularly if I was writing in the first person, that I could become a psychopath quite easily. I could think like one, and I could devise a manner of unfortunate occurrences. So I probably gave up a flourishing, lucrative career as a mass murderer. So let's get into this. This is going to be part one on Robert Bloch's work. Because after H.P. Lovecraft died in 1937, Bloch really started to get even more published, and they opened up August Derleth and was it Donald Wandre started Arkham House Publishing. But I want to read to you this story. And this one actually is available. This is actually the copy of Weird Tales from 1935 when Robert Bloch got the story The Feast in the Abbey published at 17 years old. Now, I was sending stories to Twilight Zone magazine when I was 14, and they were getting rejected. But I would get these nice messages from Rod Serling's widow in pencil at the top. So Rod Serling and his wife's ties to people like Robert Bloch, to people like the pulp writers, goes straight through to the 19th century writers like Lord Dunsany, like others, you know. And it's a very interesting thing to see how generation upon generation, whether it's because of their interests or whatever, there are these threads that tie them all together. People help each other. They're friendly to each other. They encourage each other. So I don't know how that's going to be working on for things when it comes to the internet now, but I want to read to you the story, The Feast in the Abbey by Robert Bloch, 1935, 17 years old. A clap of thunder in the sullen west heralded the approach of night and storm together, and the sky deepened to a sorcerous black. Rain fell, the wind droned dolefully, and the forest pathway through which I rode became a muddy, treacherous bog that threatened momentarily to ensnare both my steed and myself in its unwelcome embrace. A journey under such conditions is most inauspicious. In consequence, I was greatly heartened when, shortly through the storm-tossed branches, I discerned a flicker of hospitable light glimmering through mists of rain. 5 minutes later, I drew rein before the massive doors of a goodly-sized, venerable building of gray, moss-covered stone, which, from its extreme size and sanctified aspect, I rightly took to be a monastery. Even as I gazed thus perfunctorily upon it, I could see that it was a place of some importance, for it loomed most imposingly above the crumbling foundations of many smaller buildings, which had evidently once surrounded it. The force of the elements, however, was such as to preclude all further inspection or speculation, and I was only too pleased when, in reply to my continued knocking, the great oaken door was thrown open, and I stood face to face with a cowled man who courteously ushered me past the rain-swept portals into a well-lighted and spacious hallway. My benefactor was short and fat, garbed in voluminous gabardine, and from his ruddy, beaming aspect seemed a very pleasant and affable host. He introduced himself as the Abbot Henricus, head of the monkish fraternity in whose headquarters I now found myself, and begged me to accept the hospitality of the brethren until the inclemencies of the weather had somewhat abated. In reply, I informed him of my name and station, and told him that I was journeying to keep tryst with my brother in Verone, beyond the forest, but had been arrested in my journey by the storm. Just turning the page here. I like this, get to turn the page. I'll put this up on the screen a little bit for you. Okay. These civilities having been concluded, he ushered me past the paneled antechamber to the foot of a great staircase set in stone that seemed hewn out of the very wall itself. Here he called out sharply in an uncomprehended tongue, and in a moment I was startled by the sudden appearance of two blackamoors who seemed to have materialized out of nowhere, so swiftly silent had been their coming. Their stern ebony faces, kinky hair, and rolled eyes, set off by a most outlandish garb, great baggy trousers of red velvet, and waists of cloth of gold in Eastern fashion, intrigued me greatly, though they seemed curiously out of place in a Christian monastery. The Abbot Henricus addressed them now in fluent Latin, bidding one to go without and care for my horse, and ordering the other to show me to an apartment above, where, he informed me, I could change my rain-bedraggled garments for a more suitable raiment while awaiting the evening meal. I thanked my courteous host and followed the silent black automaton up the great stone staircase. The flickering torch of the giant servitor cast arabesque shadows upon bare stone walls of great age and advanced decrepitude. Clearly, the structure was very old. Indeed, The massive walls that rose outside must have been constructed in a bygone era, for the other buildings that presumably were contemporaneously erected beside this had long since fallen into irremediable, unrecognizable decay. Upon reaching the landing, my guide led me along a richly carpeted expanse of tessellated floor, between lofty walls tapestried and bedizened with draperies of black. Rich velvet finery was most unseemly for a place of worship, to my mind. Nor was my opinion shaken by the sight of the chamber, which was indicated as my own. It was fully as large as my father's study in Nimes. Its walls hung in Spanish velvets of maroon, of elegance surpassed only by their bad taste in such a place. There was a bed such as would grace the palace of a king. Furniture and other appliances were of truly regal magnificence. The blackamoor lighted a dozen mammoth candles in the silver candelabra that stood all about the room, and then bowed and withdrew. Upon inspecting the bed, I found thereupon the garments the abbot had designated for my use during the evening meal. These consisted of a suit of black velveteen with satin breeches and hose of a corresponding hue, and a sable surplice. Upon doffing my travel-worn apparel, I found that these fitted perfectly, albeit most somberly. During this time, I engaged myself in observing the room more closely. I wondered greatly at the lavishness, display of ostentation, and more greatly still at the complete absence of any religious paraphernalia. Not even a single crucifix was visible. Surely this order must be a rich and powerful one, albeit a trifle worldly, perchance akin to those societies of Malta and Cyprus whose licentiousness and extravagance has been the scandal of the world? As I thus mused, there fell upon my ears the sounds of sonorous chanting that swelled symphonically from somewhere far below. Its measured cadence rose and fell solemnly, as if it were borne from a distance incredible to human ears. It was subtly disturbing. I could distinguish neither words nor phrases that I knew, but the potent rhythm bewildered me. It welled a malefic rune, fraught with insidious, strange suggestion. Abruptly, it ceased, and I breathed unconsciously a sigh of relief. But not an instant during, just have to move this up here a little bit, the remainder of my sojourn was I wholly free from that spark of unease generated by the far distant sound of that nameless, measured chanting from below. Part 2. Never have I eaten a stranger meal than that which I partook of at the monastery of the abbot Henricus. The banquet hall was a triumph of ostentatious adornment. The meal took place in a vast chamber whose lofty eminence rose the entire height of the building to the arched and vaulted roof. The walls were hung with tapestries of purple and blood royal, emblazoned with devices and escutcheons of noble, albeit to me unknown, significance. The banquet table itself extended the length of the chamber at one end until the double doors through which I had entered from the stairs. The other end was beneath a hanging balcony, under which was the scullery entrance. About this festal board were seated some 200 churchmen in cowls and gabardines of black, who were already eagerly assailing the multitudinous array of foodstuffs with which the table was weighted. They scarcely ceased their gorging to nod a greeting when the abbot and I entered to take our place at the head of the table, but continued to devour rapaciously the wonderful array of victuals set before them, accomplishing this task in a most unseemly fashion. The abbot neither paused to motion to me to my seat, nor to intone a blessing, but immediately followed the example of his flock and proceeded directly to his stuff and to stuff his belly. Directly to stuff his belly with choice tidbits before my astounded eyes. It was certain that these Flemish barbarians were far from fastidious in their table habits. The meal was accompanied by uncouth noises from the mouths of the feasters. The food was taken up in the fingers, and the untasted remains cast upon the floor. The common decencies were often ignored. For a moment, I was dumbfounded, but natural politeness came to my rescue, so that I fell to without further ado. Half a dozen of the black servants glided silently about the board, replenishing the dishes or bearing platters filled with new and still more exotic viands. My eyes beheld marvels of cuisine upon golden platters, verily, but pearls were cast before the swine. For those cowled and hooded brethren, monks though they were, behaved like abominable boors. They wallowed in every kind of fruit, great luscious cherries, honeyed melons, pomegranates and grapes, huge plums, exotic apricots, rare figs, and dates. There were huge cheeses, fragrant and mellow, tempting soups, raisins, nuts, vegetables, and great smoking trays of fish, all served with ales and cordials that were as potent as the nectar of nepenthes. During the meal, we were regaled with music from unseen lutes wafted from the balconies above, music that triumphantly swelled in an ultimate crescendo as 6 servitors marched solemnly in, bearing an enormous platter of massy, beaten gold, in which reposed a single haunch of some smoking meat, garnished with and redolent of aromatic spices. In profound silence, they advanced and set down their burden in the center of the board, clearing away the giant candelabra and smaller dishes. Then the abbot rose, knife in hand, and carved the roast, doing so while muttering a sonorous invocation in a strange and alien tongue. Slices of meat were apportioned to the monks of the assemblage on silver plates. A marked and definite interest was apparent in this ceremony. Only politeness restrained me from questioning the abbot as to the significance of the company's behavior. I ate a portion of my meat, and I said nothing. To find such barbaric dalliance and kingly pomp in a monastic order was indeed curious, but my curiosity was regrettably dulled by copious imbibing of the potent wines set before me at the table in beaker, bumper, flask, flagon, and bejeweled cup. There were vintages of every age and distillation, curious, fragrant potions of marvelous headiness and giddy sweetness that affected me strangely. The meat was particularly and peculiarly rich and sweet. I washed it down with great draughts from the wine vessels that were now freely circulating about the table. The music ceased, and the candle glow dimmed imperceptibly into softer luminance. The storm still crashed against the walls without. The liquor sent fire through my veins, and queer fancies ran riot through my addled head. I sat almost stupefied when the company's trenchermanish appetites began at last to be satisfied. They proceeded under influence of the wine, to break the silence observed during the meal by bursting into the chorus of a ribald song. Their mirth grew, and broad jests and tales were told, adding to the merriment. Lean faces were convulsed in lascivious laughter. Fat paunches quivered with jollity. Some gave way to unseemly noise and gross gesture, and several collapsed beneath the table and were carried out by the silent blacks. I could not help but contrast the scene with that in which I would have figured I had reached Verone to take my meal at the board of my brother, the good curé. There would be no such noisome ribaldry there. I wondered vaguely if he was aware of this monastic order so close to his quiet parish. Then, abruptly, my thoughts returned to the company before me. The mirth and song had given place to less savory things, as the candles dimmed and deepening shadows wove their webs of darkness about the banquet board. Talk turned to vaguely alarming channels, and cowled faces took on a sinister aspect in the wan and flickering light. As I gazed bemused about the board, I was struck by the peculiar pallor of the assembled faces. They shone whitely in the dying light, as with a distorted mockery of death. Even the atmosphere of the room seemed changed. The rustling draperies seemed moved by unseen hands. Shadows marched along the walls. Hobgoblin shapes pranced in weird procession over the groined arches of that ceiling. The festal board looked bare and denuded. Dregs of wine besmirched the linen. Half-eaten viands covered the table's expanse. The gnawed bones on the plates seemed grim reminders of mortal fate. The conversation was ill-suited to further my peace of mind. It was far from the pious exhortations expected of such a company. Talk turned to ghosts and enchantment. Old tales were told and infused with newer horror. Legends recounted in broken whispers. Hints of eldritch potency passed from wine-smeared lips in tones sepulchrally muted. I sat somnolent no longer. I was nervous, with an increasing apprehension, greater than that I had ever known. It was almost as if I knew what was about to happen, when at last, with a curious smile, the abbot began his tale, and the monkish presence hushed their whispers and turned in their places to listen. At the same time, a black servant entered and deposited a small covered platter before his master, who regarded the dish for a moment before continuing his introductory remarks. It was fortunate, he began, addressing me, that I had ventured here to stay the evening, for there had been other travelers whose nocturnal sojournings in these woods had not reached so fortunate a termination. There was, for example, the legendary Devil's Monastery. Here he paused and coughed abstractedly before continuing. According to the accepted folklore of the region, this curious place of which he spoke was an abandoned priory deep in the heart of the woods, in which dwelt a strange company of the undead, devoted to the service of Asmodeus. Often upon the coming of darkness, the old ruins took on a preternatural semblance of their vanished glory, and the old walls were reconstructed by demon artistry to beguile the passing traveler. It was indeed fortunate that my brother had not sought me in the woods upon a night like this, for he might have blundered upon this accursed place and been bewitched into entrance, whereupon, according to the ancient chronicles, he would be seized and his body devoured in triumph by the ghoulish acolytes, that they might preserve their unnatural lives with mortal sustenance. All this was recounted in a whisper of unspeakable dread, as if it were somehow meant to convey a message to my bewildered senses. It did. As I gazed into the leering faces all about me, I realized the import of those jesting words, the ghastly mockery that lay behind the abbot's bland and cryptic smile. The Devil's Monastery, subterranean chanting of the rites to Lucifer, blasphemous magnificence, but never the sign of the cross, an abandoned priory in the deep woods, wolfish faces glaring into my own. Then 3 things happened simultaneously. The abbot slowly lifted the lid of the small tray before him. "Let us finish the meat," I think he said. Then I screamed. Lastly came the merciful thunderclap that precipitated me. The laughing monks, the abbot, the platter, and the monastery were thrown into chaotic oblivion. When I finally awoke, I lay rain-drenched in a ditch beside the mired pathway, in wet garments of black. My horse grazed in the forest nearby, but of the Abbey I could see no sign. I staggered into Verone a half-day later, and already I was quite delirious. And when I reached my brother's home, I cursed aloud beneath the windows. But my delirium lapsed into raving madness. For when he who found me there told me where my brother had gone and his probable fate, I swooned away upon the ground. I can never forget that place, nor the chanting, nor the dreadful brethren, but I pray to God that I can forget one thing before I die. That which I saw before the thunderbolt, the thing that maddens me and torments me all the more in view of what I have since learned in Verone. I know it is all true now, and I can bear the knowledge, but I can never bear the menace nor the memory of what I saw when the abbot Henricus lifted up the lid of the small silver platter to disclose the rest of the meat. It was the head of my brother. 17-year-old Robert Bloch, freaking people out in Weird Tales, 1935, 2 years after the release of King Kong. 17 years old. Holy smoke. You could see he could write. Wow, could he write? What amazing descriptive passages, poetry, symmetry, beautiful. Just beautiful. Emily Studios, thanks. He says, making something for Guard's show with my next song. He didn't ask me to. I just think he needs an ad trailer bumper. Thank you, man. I'd love to check that out. Thanks, dude. I will incorporate that with delight, as long as it doesn't have the head of my brother on it. Now, I have the conclusion of Tower. I could read it for you right now. I think I'm going to wait. I have concluded Tower. The novella is done. I think I'm going to wait because after having read Robert Bloch, I'll just let Robert Bloch's work sit for you. Think about Robert Bloch's life. What an achievement he was able to the many achievements he was able to make, many achievements in his life. And just think a little bit about, nowadays, short stories, there's really not a market for short stories unless people are doing them themselves, putting them out online, and they have maybe a different, an additional presence, like an online show like this, just sort of starting off, budding. There are some booktubers who put out their own books. They have some fairly sizable audiences on YouTube, even though Booktube isn't like massive, but they've been able to sell some pretty good numbers of copies. Publishing is changing. And as we mentioned, AI is really starting to fill a lot of slots at Amazon and all over the place. And I noticed, as I mentioned last night, I noticed that there are many, many channels starting up about pop culture, your favorite TV show, 10 things you didn't know about Starsky and Hutch, that sort of thing, as I love Starsky and Hutch. And then you can tell, no, this is AI creation, because there are a couple things that don't match. There are pictures there that don't match what they're saying. And obviously they didn't check it over after they had the AI collect all the data and the visuals and put it together for them. And so, again, I think that it comes to this connection. It's respect, I think, for the people who came before us and worked so hard, and respect for oneself to say, I want to write my own stories. I want to exercise my abilities. I want to do respect to the things that entertained me. And the people who are reading, I want them to know this is a person offering you something. A handshake, a smile across the bank teller's window at the convenience store, saying hi to your friend, whatever, family dinner, family gathering, that sort of personal connection here online with me and you. I think that's really going to be important as AI really grows. And so bringing up some of these people inspires me to remember their memory. I never met Robert Bloch. I knew people who were friends with him. And it's a weird thing to think about growing up in an environment where storytelling influenced me so dramatically. One of the greatest things I ever got was a story called Thrillers and Chillers. It was a record called Thrillers and Chillers from Troll Records. And I've mentioned, I played a couple of the segments last year around this time. They had Monkey's Paw by W.W. Jacobs. It had The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe, had The Boy Who Drew Cats, and it had The Open Window. And just H.H. Munro was Boy Who Drew Cats, and Open Window was Saki. And wonderful, amazing short things on two sides of an LP. And, thinking about those stories and, some of the stories that we've been able to read here, it really does make me want to continue writing in a way that does honor to these people. And I think there's a real strong value in that. And again, if you go to Horror Babble on YouTube, they read those stories themselves. There are a few that are out there now that are, just mass producing HP Lovecraft stuff through AI. You can kind of tell, they're recent, and the voice is sort of like, I think this is an AI thing. The people who are really reading things. In fact, some of the errors of me reading live, they're going to indicate to people years from now that this was a real thing. This is a real guy just sitting here reading. And I want to do more of that. I'd like to do some more short stories occasionally. And occasionally there are weird impediments sometimes, like that on the screen. It was, I had to move the cursor and I got lost a little bit there. And so hopefully that was okay. But I'm not going to edit it. I'll just leave it as this. There's a pure form of this. Again, if you want to get Horror Babble, they put out a pure form of this just recently. It's phenomenal. I love those guys at Horror Babble. They're British, good people. And again, if you go to Tales to Terrify, you'll see some old stuff that have been read by some wonderful people. So, check those out. And hopefully every once in a while I come across an AI video and I don't realize it's AI, and I'll start watching it. And I always wait to give it like a thumbs up on YouTube or whatever, or to subscribe to the channel, even though I think, well, this is good, I start to really look around. And then if I find out it's AI, I go down in the comments section and I mention like, oh, you can tell this is AI and so on and so forth. And it's up to individuals to do it. But I do think that as things sort of get sifted, the wheat from the chaff or the gold nuggets from the dirt, that personal connection means something. Let me know what you think, and we'll close things off tonight for Friday. And I'll read you The End of Tower next week, and then we'll get the publishing going on that. Oh, Harry, you got a great comment. He says, storytelling is how we got all our religion, thousands of years of storytelling. Well, and some of it, history passed on for some people. You look at books of the Bible and things like that written down. Harry says, this definitely expands my vocabulary. Thanks, Gard. Love and peace. He says, peace to all. Thanks, man. Skunk Hollow is there. He says, read it. Yeah. Badass. And and you probably could see that coming, that it was going to be the body part of his brother or something, like the head of his brother. But again, as a guy who was 14 writing stories that I was hoping to get published by Twilight Zone magazine, check this out. Funniest thing was the story that I wrote for Twilight Zone magazine was a time travel story. And it got rejected. But curiously enough, 12 Monkeys, right? The movie 12 Monkeys is based on a short film that Terry Gilliam saw. It's a French film. It's called like The Airport or something like that, or Airport Terminal or something. And now there are some spoilers here if you know 12 Monkeys, the film. The TV series was great, by the way. Terry Metalis did a great job. Terry's a really nice guy, by the way. I've met Terry a couple times. He's a really good guy. So the ending of 12 Monkeys reveals that the main character, played by Bruce Willis, kept having these memories where he was seeing somebody with long hair running through an airport. He kept seeing this person. And I think the one mistake that Terry Gilliam made during the bulk of the movie was when Bruce Willis's character would have these memories. So the setup for 12 Monkeys is he comes from the future. There's been a pandemic. Some virus was released by some terrorist group or something. It had been developed by the military, but was released by some crazy person, and it killed like 3/4 of the population. Everybody else lives underground until the virus is gone. So they discover they can send people back in time. He's sent back to stop the epidemic. And at the end of the story, he can't stop it because time has already been established. It's just fate. And you see during the film, he sees himself as a little kid watching someone running somewhere, and as a man and a woman running. Well, it turns out in the end of the movie, it's himself as an adult running in an airport with Madeline Stowe. Oh, Madeline Stowe. Yes, I know. What was it? Last of the Mohicans. Oh man, she was amazing. But he is a little kid seeing himself get shot and seeing his efforts come to naught. Curiously enough, I wrote a story when I was 14 about a guy who lives in Washington, and he has discovered that there's some plot to do something that would damage the world. And he goes to his apartment, and he's blown. You don't know what's going on. He's going to his apartment. He goes to click the door, and something clicks, and he's blown out of the apartment. But he survives. He lands on the ground, and he gets up, and he looks at the newspaper thing is like a newspaper kiosk. It has the date, and the date is when the hostages were taken in Iran. He's like, what is this? This is a joke. And he goes and he opens it up, and he pulls the paper out, and the paper says the same thing behind it. It's not a fake. It's not like somebody was pulling a prank. So what's going on? So he realizes he's gone back in time. And now he knows that he can alert people. So he goes down into the metro station, and on the way to his apartment, he had run into this beautiful woman he had wanted to ask out. And he's at the metro station, and the lights go out, and everything just goes still, and there's nobody else in there, and you can hear these footsteps, and it's this woman. And she has followed him back in time. She's like, I was sent to kill you. He's like, what are you talking about? So he tries to get away from her, and he falls into the metro rails, and he tries to get up, and he hits the third rail. And so the name of the story is The Third Rail. And he gets electrocuted. And the news report comes on the news later. And we go from him getting electrocuted to the news report about a man being found inside the metro, having been electrocuted. He evidently jumped down, committed suicide on the third rail. So it's, you know, it's all a cover up. And it's a little boy sitting in front of the television set at that time, when was it, 70, whatever, 7 or 78, I don't know, 79, I don't know. And this little boy says, wow, he got electrocuted? And his mother says, yes, you have to be very careful. And she uses his name. And so he saw the news report of his own death. And I have it as he's dying. He remembers back to his mother and his loving mother and stuff. And there's just a little reference to it. And then we go to the little boy. So interestingly enough, it was the same sort of pattern as we saw for 12 Monkeys. And I was watching 12 Monkeys. I knew exactly what was going to happen. I was like, this is just like the story I wrote when I was 14, right? Because, you know, if you think those ways, you know how it's going to go. You probably predicted how it was going to go on 12 Monkeys too, right? So, but it was interesting because I sent that story off and it got rejected by the Twilight Zone magazine, published by Mrs. Serling, but she wrote a note at the top of it. And I had another story that I had written too. And she wrote a note at the top, very encouraging. So, you know, keep at it. We couldn't publish this one, but keep submitting. And it makes me think about Robert Bloch. And, you know, if I had been around when Robert Bloch was around, I would have been writing to HP Lovecraft just like Robert Bloch was, you know? And a peas in a pod. And it is something else to see. There are just certain kinds of people, and you hit the niches, whether it's pro-liberty, you know, being a libertarian, and, you know, I drive down to Foundation for Economic Education, or you and I are chatting here and you found this show, or it's writers or music, you know, you find commonality with certain kinds of music, or whatever it is, hiking or bird watching. It's very interesting. You find that there were these people who came before you, and they thought a lot. They had the same interests. They were just different generations. Like my mentors, F. Paul Wilson and Tom Monteleone. You know, they're 30 years my elders, or, you know, 20 years my elders, right? But if we had gone to high school together, we'd be hanging out. You know, it's kind of cool. It's a neat thing. So God bless Robert Bloch. He scared a lot of people, and boy, could he write. And we'll give you more on the Robert Bloch biography, read another story. We'll go into Psycho as well, talk about Psycho and some of the secrets about Psycho and things like that, and what I learned about the script from Joe Stefano, actually meeting him in person and stuff like that. So, you know, whatever it is, we'll have a good time talking about it. It'll be fun. So thanks, everybody, for being around. And thank you for watching. If you're watching on the former Star Trek Writing Fellow channel. Taylor Saunders says, maybe 12 Monkeys was based on your story, Guard. You know, it's very interesting because I doubt it, obviously, because it really couldn't have been exposed to more than a few people. T.E.D. Klein saw it, and Ted Klein was the editor at Twilight Zone magazine. And I'll give you another example. I was agnostic for much of my teen years. I was going to go to school for astrophysics at Cornell, wanted to study with Carl Sagan. Big fan. I had every episode of Cosmos memorized because I recorded it in audio and listened to it over and over and over and over again. Like, I was really, really into astronomy and astrophysics and stuff like that. So I got into science fiction big time. I used to, when I was 9, I used to sit there and theorize about E equals MC squared and relativity and, you know, gravity wells and stuff like that. And so I almost went to school for that, but I didn't do well enough in the engineering parts of my physics classes with force vectors relying on geometry, because I had a bad geometry teacher. So I ended up going into concentrating on creative writing and film and stuff like that, and then political philosophy, which is really kind of like, if you get an engineering mind, logic and political philosophy and ethics are sort of similar. You get Aristotle, similar sort of thing. So it was interesting because, you know, I got a subscription to Twilight Zone when I was a kid. My mom got it for me. I didn't know then who, you know, the editor was. I knew Carol Serling, Rod Serling's widow, and how nice she was to me, and how that sort of tied in with being a 7-year-old kid listening to the records of Edgar Allan Poe and, you know, Monkey's Paw and stuff. So there was that connection. And I remembered watching Rod Serling on Night Gallery in the little screen and stuff, you know. And so there's this weird entertainment transmission, radiation of stories that comes out to you, it radiates to you. You know, it's this other profession. You know about radio plays, Rod Serling. Again, my mom went to high school in Binghamton. She was like 2 years ahead of Rod Serling. Like he was a freshman and she was a junior, I think. So it's like she knew Rod Serling and stuff, you know, and he used to do little radio plays on the school's loudspeaker system after school. They would do little radio plays with sound effects and all these things. So he was really into it as a kid. And I used to do that on loop, you know, reel-to-reel tape recorders and stuff, sound effects. And, you know, I'd use harmonicas to make robot sounds and stuff and explosions. And I'd do multi-tracking and stuff. So it was really weird because it wasn't until later that I discovered I got the Mammoth Book of Horror, of the best horror novellas. And in it is a story called There's a Long, Long Road, a Winding by, who's the guy who was Russell Kirk. Russell Kirk, who was a professor at Hillsdale. My brother had him for English, actually. And on Halloween, he would get the kids and sit around like in the school cafeteria or whatever and read stories, or maybe he'd invite them over and they'd have like apple cider or something in his house. So I can't remember how it worked, but he would read stories and it was just the best. My brother said it was like the coolest thing. In that book, the Mammoth Book is a novella by T.E.D. Klein, and it's called Nadelman's God. And again, I was agnostic until I read that story. And if you read, and a lot of people, so T.D. Klein, I'm sort of going off the field. I didn't know we'd go on this long on this segment, but you can tell how much I love this stuff. I mean, this is what sustains me, is the fiction and liberty stuff and rock and roll and friendship and stuff like that. It's so good to talk positive things and principles and people, you know, achieving things with their talents that are given to them by God. But I was not a believer until what cracked it open was the ending of Nadelman's God. And I'm telling you, a lot of people mention this book by T.E.D. Klein. It's the one collection of stories that he ever had released. It's called Dark Gods. He also has a novel that was released called The Ceremonies. That's based on one of the novellas in Dark Gods. It's called The Events at Porroth Farm. Now, The Events at Porroth Farm, the original novella, is in Dark Gods. There are four novellas in that. And he has basically written hardly anything else other than editing Twilight Zone magazine. He worked as an ad copywriter in Manhattan. That's how he made his bread and butter, mostly after he left Twilight Zone. And so that's what he did. He just hasn't written very many other stories, but he's legendary. Like, you know how on True Detective, they would talk about Tom Ligotti, and they talk about The King in Yellow and Carcosa, and they also would mention Laird Barron. Laird Barron originally lived in Alaska, did the Iditarod a bunch of times, lives in New York State. So Laird Barron and Ligotti are seen as sort of modern Lovecraftians. Laird Barron was the only person I've seen compared to T.E.D. Klein. I spoke with Ellen Datlow one time, and she said, yeah, his stuff reminds me of T.D. Klein. I was like, that's exactly it. So Laird Barron's great. He's really, really good. T.D. Klein stuff is a little bit more accessible. And of the novellas, people often mention The Events at Porroth Farm, or a story called Petey, or another one called Black Man with a Horn, as being the best novellas in that collection, Dark Gods. To me, they don't hold a candle to Nadelman's God. Nadelman's God, if you read that story, the ending of Nadelman's God is, it really shook me up. It actually got me thinking, you know what? There is evil. There is evil out there. And again, I didn't know that he was the editor of Twilight Zone magazine when I was a kid. So when I was a kid, I was sending that short story to T.D. Klein. So to get back to your point, Taylor, Maybe 12 Monkeys was based on my story. So 12 Monkeys, again, based on that French story. I don't think there's any connection between T.D. Klein, having read the story or anything like that, because they're very, very common things that pop up. What you will see, however, and I'm not going to say which stories they are, but there are 2 stories on Star Trek Voyager, and this is the most I've opened up about this, that are my stories. And I never got credit. And I never sued. And I got ripped off twice. One of the stories is a story that I pitched to Star Trek called Monument. I called it Monument. And it was about how the Voyager crew is stuck in the Delta Quadrant, and there is a story inside the Star Trek lore about a lost Vulcan tribe. This is what the Star Trek thing is. It's just, it came around during the course of Star Trek stories. And, the Romulans and the Vulcans were both based on the original root race. One became very violent, the Romulans. The other became very logical. They went to different planets. But there was another tribe that got lost. They never knew where they were. Well, I suppose that maybe they got lost in the same area where the Voyager crew was lost, the Delta Quadrant. So I said, what if they are gone now, but there's a monument that's infused with this Katra energy that the Vulcans do with their mind meld stuff, that the last Vulcan alive infused this thing with his memory. But you don't know this until you get to the planet and the Vulcan Tuvok touches this thing, and you don't know this at all. You don't know that it's been infused. He just touches this stone on this desolate world, and he's in this jungle world, and he's with these settlers. Some of them are Vulcans, and they're getting attacked. They're getting wiped out. And rather than having a resolution in the last few minutes of the show, it's at the last second of the episode, he's pulled out of it as he's dying. And he's in the mind of this person, and you realize the last of the Vulcans of this settler colony that got wiped out by this other foreign alien race, whatever, put his story into this monument. So I pitched that to Star Trek. Somebody else did it. That person went on to doing an entire multi-year series at CBS, became producer, and so on and so forth. I pitched it to him over the phone. And yeah, there was another story, and that one had to do, earlier than that, had to do with the Vulcan, Tuvok. And I said, okay, they're in the Delta Quadrant. The Vulcans have to go through their Ponfar. They have to go back to their home planet to mate. But he can't do that because he's stuck in the Delta Quadrant. So what would he do? He's going to die if he doesn't mate. That's the way the Vulcans work. Because we saw in Star Trek, Spock had to go back because in the episode Amok Time. So if I'm getting too into the weeds and you don't know Star Trek, don't worry about it. But so I suppose what would he do? He would try to suppress his body with chemicals on this reproductive urge, and then maybe they could recreate his home life and his wife in the hologram room, right? So that's what I did. I had this story about Tuvok going through Ponfar. He can't get back home. He's going to die. So they recreate it. You have this touching moment where he gets to see the recreation of his wife and his already existent son. He has a son. And his son says, when are you coming back, Father? We miss you, that sort of thing. And it's very heartbreaking. And the hologrammatic doctor leads him in there, played by Robert Picardo, who's a real nice guy, by the way. So before I went to Outer Limits, I sent that story to Star Trek, and I didn't hear back. I went to work at Outer Limits, I sent it as an outline, turned the story into a full script, sent it off. I didn't have an agent yet. Sent it off to an agent. The agent said, I'd like to represent you. Came back here at Christmas time, 1996, after my time at Outer Limits. Got a call from a friend of mine. Says, hey, Gard, remember that story you told me about Tuvok going through Ponfar? I'm like, yeah. He goes, are you going to watch, he says, Gard, you going to watch Voyager tonight? I was like, sometimes I watch, it was the Paramount Network. Sometimes I watch, he goes, I think you might want to watch tonight. I was like, why? He goes, because that story you told me you wrote about, the Vulcan and Ponfar and stuff? I was like, yeah. He goes, I'm looking at TV Guide and there's a story that sounds exactly like that. So I turned on the TV and I sat on the bed where as a kid, and I watched, I slept as a kid, and I'm watching literal lines of dialogue that I wrote, and the actors are saying it. Robert Picardo saying stuff that I wrote. It was weird. It was really weird because I'd been robbed, right? And you're like, whoa. And you don't know. So check this out. A week after that show is broadcast, let me get Robert Bloch off the screen here. A week after that show's broadcast, I got a call from a person at Star Trek, the person who wrote that script. And this person says, oh, hi, Gardner, it's so-and-so at Star Trek Voyager. Hey, we just came across your material. How'd you like to come do the Writers Guild Fellowship with us? Now, what do you say? You're on the phone. You've got an opportunity to work with Star Trek. What do you do? I was like, oh, that's funny because I didn't say it, but I could have just blown up right then. My brother's a lawyer. I could have said, yeah, well, guess what? You're going to hear from my brother tomorrow, right? But I didn't want to get the government involved with I just didn't think it was right. It's like, no. So I let it drop. I found out later that if I had tried to bring some suit, Star Trek and their resources, I learned from Narain Shankar, actually. Narain was the guy who wrote at Outer Limits and ended up producing The Expanse. He had worked at Star Trek Next Generation, and in something else that had happened at Outer Limits, he said, oh, Star Trek fights everything. He says, they've got the resources. They will get into legal battles with people big time. Because so many people try to sue TV shows for no reason. They'll just try to gouge them. So it's in their best interest to fight, oftentimes most honestly to fight, But in this case, I would have been in the right, but I didn't bring any suit. And it was funny because when I went to Star Trek, I saw David Gerrold, who wrote, Trouble with Tribbles. I went to a Gallifrey 1 convention. This girl named Jill at Deep Space Nine was one of the organizers for Gallifrey 1. And she's like, oh, you want to come? I was like, yeah, sure. So we went to Gallifrey 1 this particular weekend, and I met David Gerrold. And I said to David, oh, I'm going to be pitching to Voyager, next Tuesday or whatever. He goes, good luck. I was like, what? He goes, I'm never pitching to them again. I was like, what do you mean? He goes, oh, they rip off everybody. I was like, oh, okay. So I did pitch to Jerry Taylor, who was the producer. And I took the B story of that story that had been utilized, and I had amplified it and made it its own thing. And I said, oh, Jerry, this is the B story to the outline that I sent over. She goes, outline? What are you talking about? And I was like, well, the outline that, how I get the fellowship thing here with the Writers Guild. She goes, that's not the way it works. We're supposed to accept a full script. She says, if we accept an outline, we're supposed to give you a story credit. And at that moment, I could have said, well, it's funny you should mention it. So just to round things off, they had so at Star Trek, outside writers would come in every day to meet with the staff writers. And the staff writers had to keep track of all the stories that were pitched to them and file something with Star Trek to make sure everything was on the up and up, and that they had a record of all the stories that had been pitched to them in case somebody came to them and said, you took one of my stories. So if they accepted a story, they would give you, I think, $6,000 or something like that. And then if you had enough stories accepted by Star Trek, then they might come to you to write a full script, which would be like, at that time, like $12,000, I think it was, or 20. I don't even remember. But anyway, you had to show that you were a good story output person. And if they could rely on you, they'd say, okay, you've sold us enough of your outlines. We've turned those into scripts. We've paid you for those. Let's go with you for a script now. And there were only a few outside writers. Most of it was done in-house. Mostly the writers themselves in-house would come up with their ideas, but occasionally they would buy one from an outside writer. But they had to keep very, very close tabs on those. So there was a filing cabinet that had all of the stories that had been pitched. So I went into the filing cabinet and I checked on when the particular staff writer pitched that story about the Ponfar thing. Now, on Star Trek Voyager, it was not Tuvok in the end. It was Rorik. He was a Vulcan as well. He was actually played by Jerry Taylor's son. So Rorik is going through Ponfar in the story that was produced, not Tuvok, the way I had pitched it. But when I went in, the original writer, the one who called me on the phone, that writer had pitched it as Tuvok, and then they changed it. So it was very clear that it was my story. And it's weird. But again, you know, I mentioned this to Ferb when we got together today. I got to see Ferb. So we were talking about how, you know, circumstances, if I had brought suit and I had won, I would have had my story credit. I would have gotten paid. I would have been established at 2 TV shows. I would have stayed in LA. I would not have been here to hold my mom's hand when she died. I wouldn't have been here to shovel the driveway for my parents, or to be here with my niece on all these occasions when we told stories, to fly her around, to play Captain Hook with her with sticks and sword fights. You know, I wouldn't have met Ferb. I wouldn't have met David Knight or Travis or Karen or Tony or any of you guys. None of this would happen now. I wouldn't have written these novellas and all these different things. I wouldn't have gotten sick the way I've gotten sick and started reading the Bible more. Everything would have been different. And a lot of the most important things that I've been able to do in my life came because I got hurt, because I got injured by these people. And I made decisions that might not have seemed to some people to be in my best interest, but I thought they were the right decisions at the time. And, you know, sometimes you make mistakes, and it turns out that God has considered those things and put them in the right line for you. And, you know, maybe everything doesn't turn out for the best, but maybe it's a defense posture where you say, well, I'm going to look on the bright side or whatever. But I do think that it was for the best. And I'm certainly glad I'm not in LA now. That's for darn sure, right? So there's a little story, some background on the Star Trek stuff. And, you know, I'm not going to name any names or anything like that. Skunk Hollow says Janeway was a hot chick in a Chevy Chase movie. Yeah, and Real Jason Barker says, I like the storyline for The Expanse. It's within the solar system, Mars, Earth, and Belters. Yeah, and if you read the books, one of the cool things, so Narain, the executive producer, Narain Shankar, Narain studied at Cornell. I actually would have been in college with Narain if I'd gone to Cornell, and he studied engineering. And so he's very, very keen. And so are the writers, the brothers who write the Expanse novels. They're very keen on trying to make the science right. So if you at the opening of the first Expanse book, you'll notice that they've got this thing about gravity and stuff with this girl who's a stowaway aboard a ship. And it's spot on. It's really, really good. Very interesting stuff. And yeah, so those are, it's interesting, you know, the way that things come around, and then how you have to work harder. You know, I have to work harder now because prose writing is much more difficult than script writing. Script writing is really easy. It's like, anyway, for me, it's easy. I don't want to downplay it for other people, but I just have a knack at it because I just was immersed in that, you know, since I was a kid, listening to dialogue and stuff, you know. But prose writing is different. There's the rhythm, there's the paragraphs, there's the word choices, all these different things, characterization, you know, is it too purple? Is it, you know, this sort of thing, the prose. And I'm consistently impressed by a lot of these people like Robert Bloch, who I think their names are known, but I don't think people understand in many cases until they read them what good stylists they were. And there are some writers, as I mentioned, there are some writers out there, F. Paul Wilson, Tom Monteleone, and others, who have the capacity to write very, very high level stuff and have the capacity to write other stuff that's much more accessible. You'll often see the style get toned down for longer pieces, because in longer pieces, the very flowery prose becomes a little bit difficult. It becomes a bit of a slog for some people. So I'll give you an example. Clark Ashton Smith one of the best stylists of the 20th century. His plots don't really go very far. His short stories are pretty good, but the longer they get, the harder it is to read them because they're just so dense. They're really dense. The same thing with E.R. Edison, one of the greatest writers, I think, of human history. His Jacobean prose is so rich that, again, I only take it in pieces because to read long stretches of it becomes difficult. Sometimes one can read the text and then go to an audio version and then absorb some more of it that way. It's very interesting. You look at people, even some of the people who wrote for kids, excuse me, people like Robert Louis Stevenson, considered children's writers. Amazing writing, amazing, just incredible stuff. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. But thanks. We'll have to open this up for conversation. Again, I always want to welcome you. If you want to come on and talk stories one night when we're doing fantastic fiction stuff, Fiction Fridays or Wordsmith Wednesdays or anything, just let me know. As I love talking about these things. And if there's stories, you want to punch it in there and get that story idea in there, we'll do it. It'll be great. I might split this off into 2 sections. I might excise the Star Trek stuff out for the former Star Trek Writing Fellow channel. I think it's okay to leave it in there. Bygones are bygones, and hopefully by saying these things, I'm not besmirching people too much or anything like that. But I think it's pretty clear. And I have my writing. I have the dates on when I came up with the story ideas and stuff too. So there you go. But anyway, that's not important right now. So thank you, Skunk Hollow, for being there. Mark Young, thank you. Rock out. Tony says, wow, Guard's still going. Happy Friday, everyone. I love Fiction Friday. Thanks, man. Oh, Fletch. Great books. Very witty books, those Fletch books. Very witty books. They picked a good one for those for the Fletch movies. Good stuff. All right, I better get rolling. Thanks, everybody, for hanging out. I'm going to leave you with the Outer Limits going out. What do they call that? The outro voice. And I'm trying to mute the screen audio there. There we go. It's taking a second so we don't get the echo. And don't forget, if you want to support the channel, then you can do so at Rumble. You can become a subscriber at the Rumble channel for Liberty Conspiracy. You can do my Substack. That's a great way to do it. And you'll get the news notes for all the breaking news Monday through Friday. That's a great way to do it. You can always head over to the Substack and find my PayPal inside the audios for Liberty Conspiracy every night. You can go to Wise Wolf Gold and Silver Exchange through my Substack at the top, and I'll get a percentage if you sign on there. And I'll leave you with that. We're going to go with the Outer Limits. Remember Robert Bloch. I think you'll like him. Have a great night, and God bless everybody. Thank you, everyone, for being such great people. Appreciate it. Take care.
We now return control of your television set to you until next week at this same time, when the control voice will take you to the Outer Limits.